Zadie, a graceful 28-year-old black woman, carried the future of a billion-dollar empire not in a briefcase, but beneath the silk of her maternity dress. She was a woman who had fought hard for every single success, a fact that made the effortless luxury surrounding her feel like a hard-won victory. As she entered the Gilded Fork, a monument to old money and privilege, the last thing she expected was a public execution. What happened next was fast, ugly, and instantly viral. A young white waitress, fueled by silent rage and resentment, marched past her table and, with calculated malice, dumped an entire pitcher of ice water directly onto Zadie's visibly pregnant body. The water was cold, but the ensuing shock and humiliation burned hotter than any fire, sparking a corporate war that the waitress, unaware she had just soaked the CEO's wife, could never have predicted. Zadie was dressed in a beautiful emerald green dress, chosen to celebrate a milestone she and her husband, Alistair, were reaching together. Her pregnancy was well into its third trimester, and every movement was slow and deliberate. She'd chosen a secluded booth at the Gilded Fork, a restaurant known for its hushed tones and impeccable service. She arrived slightly early, which was unusual for her, and she settled in, pulling out her phone for a less extreme event, checking a few emails while she waited for Alistair. A young woman, the white waitress named Bridget, hurried past the table. Bridget was thin, with tight features and eyes that seemed constantly shadowed by resentment. She looked exhausted, overworked, and on the verge of a breakdown. Bridget was carrying a full tray of glassware, rattling precariously as she tried to navigate the crowded floor. Suddenly, Bridget stumbled, not an accidental slip, but a sharp, purposeful shift of her body near Zadie's table. The large glass of ice water she was carrying pitched forward and emptied completely over Zadie's head and chest. The water cascaded down the silk dress, pooling in her lap. The cold was shocking, but the look on Bridget's face was worse. Bridget offered a shallow, passive-aggressive apology, her tone dripping with disdain. "Oops, my bad. Watch where you sit next time, lady." She grabbed a few napkins and tossed them onto the table, then walked off without even looking back. The public humiliation was absolute. Zadie sat frozen, soaked and shivering, utterly stunned by the blatant malice directed at her pregnant body when the doors to the restaurant suddenly opened. Zadie looked up, not at the perpetrator, but past her, seeing her husband, Alistair, walking through the entrance. Alistair's anger was terrifying because it wasn't loud. It was glacial, a storm forming behind eyes that usually held professional detachment. Zadie, still dripping, felt a strange pang of disappointment. She wanted him to roar, to demand justice, but he simply stood there, assessing the scene like a general surveying a ruined battleground. This cool calculation was often what made him successful, but right now, it felt like a betrayal. Bridget, momentarily shocked into stillness, started to stutter an apology, but Alistair cut her off with a gesture that halted her dead. Without a word, he took off the bespoke jacket he was wearing, a beautiful, dark wool piece, and gently draped it over Zadie's shoulders. He didn't look at her face. His attention was still focused entirely on the waitress. It was a shield, a silent declaration of protection. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a pen. His actions were slow, deliberate, and profoundly unsettling. Alistair looked directly into Bridget's terrified eyes and asked, in a low, measured voice, "What is your full name?" Bridget, stammering, gave him the name. He wrote it down with the meticulous care of a scholar, confirming the spelling before snapping the notebook shut. Bridget tried again to insist it was an accident. The water just slipped. Alistair finally spoke, and his voice was so soft it forced Bridget to lean in, amplifying the impact of his words. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career, and possibly your life." He didn't threaten to fire her. The implication was far grander and more terrifying. He then smoothly placed his arm around Zadie's back, guiding her away from the table. They didn't touch the silverware or the menus. They simply walked out of the opulent restaurant without a word to the manager or a look back. They left a stunned, silent dining room behind them. Bridget watched the retreating back of the man who had just taken her name, feeling a terrifying cold dread deep in her gut, still utterly unaware of the true identity of the woman she had just targeted. The next morning, the corporate offices of Sterling Global were paralyzed by an unspoken fear. Alastair Sterling didn't do public outbursts, but his assistant had called in an emergency meeting of the entire restaurant division's executive team. The atmosphere in the massive, mahogany boardroom was tense, the executives whispering nervously about layoffs and hostile takeovers. They all knew something personal had triggered the CEO. Alastair walked in precisely on time, his demeanor colder than the ice that had drenched his wife the previous night. He didn't offer greetings or small talk. He launched straight into a surgical breakdown of corporate policy. His official stated reason was a catastrophic failure of customer service and decorum at the Gilded Fork. He never once mentioned Zadie's name or the incident itself. He demanded a full, top-to-bottom financial and operational audit of the entire restaurant subsidiary. This was the less extreme event, cloaked in business terms. But then, he escalated. Alastair then ordered the chief HR officer to provide him with complete employee profiles for the Gilded Fork, dating back 3 years, including performance reviews and internal incident reports. He wanted to know which staff members had disciplinary issues. His final instruction was delivered with such chilling precision that everyone in the room instinctively straightened up. Alastair leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though it resonated clearly through the huge room. I want every scrap of information you can find on one employee, Bridget. Her history, her bank records, her social media activity, and every complaint ever lodged against her, whether formal or informal. He made it clear that this wasn't about a mere reprimand. This was a personal and professional annihilation. I want to know her life story, gentlemen, and I want it before the end of the day, he concluded, dismissing the shaken executives. The team scrambled out, understanding that they were not just performing an audit, but executing a private, cold-blooded act of vengeance for their CEO. Zadie felt surprisingly hollow when Alastair told her that the corporate machinery was fully engaged. She was safe, warm, and her husband was preparing to dismantle a young woman's career. Yet the satisfaction she thought she'd feel was missing. The revenge was clean, sterile, and corporate, but the feeling of being violated still lingered deep in her bones. She needed to talk to someone who understood more than just business strategy. She called her lifelong friend, Kiera, and poured out the story, emphasizing not the water, but the look of pure, unadulterated contempt in Bridget's eyes. As she spoke, the memory of the cold water suddenly triggered a profound and painful flashback. Zadie recalled being 13 years old, attending a mostly white, affluent private school, and being relentlessly bullied by a group of older students. The emotional contrast was stark. The 13-year-old Zadie, thin and awkward, had gone to her teacher for help, only to have the woman dismiss her concerns with a patronizing tone, implying that Zadie was too sensitive. The teacher had made her feel like the problem, not the victim. That memory of a white authority figure silencing her pain had never truly left her. The extreme event in the present was the realization that the water incident was not just a one-off racist insult. It was a powerful, devastating echo of her deepest childhood trauma. She was no longer just Zadie, the CEO's wife. She was a black woman, heavily pregnant, who was reminded in the cruelest way possible that she was still a target. The shame and powerlessness felt amplified by her pregnancy. Zadie began to weep uncontrollably into the phone, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. "Kiera," she choked out, "I'm not crying for myself. I'm terrified of bringing our baby into a world where I can't even protect myself from sneering Waitress. I feel so exposed, like the fight is still raging, even now that I have everything." The terror of vulnerability, intensified by motherhood, was a profound, suffocating weight. The aftermath of Bridget's outburst was surprisingly anticlimactic for her at first. She was called into the manager's office later that evening, but the meeting was short and mostly about inventory. The manager handed her a single sheet of paper, a written warning for clocking in 3 minutes late the week before. It was minor, irritating, and nothing close to the life-changing disaster she expected. It was a less extreme event that almost made her laugh in relief. She went home that night to her small, third-floor apartment, exhausted and convinced she had dodged a bullet. The powerful man had been a flash in the pan. She ate a cheap takeout meal on her worn, thrift store couch, scrolling through her phone, already forgetting the wealthy, pregnant woman and her stoic husband. She was worried about making rent, not corporate retribution. The true extreme event arrived the following afternoon. There was a sharp, unfamiliar knock on her door, a sound that wasn't the landlord or a neighbor. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a perfectly tailored, expensive suit, holding a briefcase. This was Mr. Vance, Alastair Sterling's personal, impeccably cold assistant. Bridget cautiously opened the door, her heart immediately starting to pound with instinctive fear. Mr. Vance's face was utterly devoid of emotion, a corporate mask of efficiency. He said nothing, simply extended a long, cream-colored envelope sealed with a heavy, silver logo, the mark of Sterling Global. It wasn't a pink slip. It was a formal legal summons. The document informed Bridget that she was required to appear at the Sterling Global corporate headquarters at 9 o'clock the next morning for a compulsory meeting regarding disciplinary action and pending civil investigation. She stared, her mind racing, unable to comprehend the scale of the paperwork. Mr. Vance offered one last, chilling instruction, delivered with the quiet authority of a man used to giving orders. "Do not be late, Miss Bridget. Mr. Sterling does not tolerate delays." He turned and was gone, leaving Bridget standing alone, holding the heavy envelope, the fear of losing her job instantly replaced by the terrifying realization that she was about to face a power she couldn't possibly fight. If you're loving the story so far, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. Bridget sat in the stale air of her apartment, the corporate summons lying on her battered kitchen table. The immediate fear of being fired had subsided, replaced by a deep, familiar weariness. This feeling was a constant companion from her childhood. She looked at the cracked paint on her wall, and her mind drifted back to her past, a less extreme event, but one that was constantly eroding her life. She remembered growing up with her single mother, Melinda. Melinda loved her, but her constant battles with prescription pill addiction meant their lives were chaotic, marked by eviction notices and sudden moves. Bridget never had stability, always the new, poor kid at school, the one who smelled faintly of old cigarettes and desperation. It taught her to be guarded and to expect the worst from people who had more. The extreme event that truly shaped her rage happened when she was 18. She was working at a small, family-owned diner called the Silver Spoon. She was meticulous, hoping to save enough for a community college. The manager, a cold, older woman named Mrs. Evelyn Price, had falsely accused Bridget of stealing $200 from the till. Despite Bridget's tearful protests and her clean record, Mrs. Price was unforgiving. Bridget was fired on the spot, and Mrs. Price made sure that every decent restaurant in the area heard the story, effectively blacklisting her. This act of injustice, committed by a woman of means who saw Bridget as disposable, hardened her heart and taught her that the rich always win. That single lie stole her ambition and replaced it with bitter resentment against anyone who felt privileged enough to look down on her. Bridget had never forgotten the smug, unforgiving look on Mrs. Price's face. She kept the crumpled police report she had filed, which went nowhere, tucked away in a box, a painful souvenir of that profound betrayal. That document was the physical proof of her ruin. Little did she know, That police report was about to become the key to her undoing and her future. Bridget arrived at Sterling Global headquarters the next morning, her cheap dress ironed to perfection, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was ushered into Alastair Sterling's massive, panoramic office. The sheer luxury of the space was dizzying. Zadie, the pregnant woman, was already seated quietly on a plush velvet chair next to Alastair, her expression unreadable. The extreme event started instantly. Alastair said nothing. He just pressed a remote control. A huge screen descended from the ceiling, and the crystal-clear security footage of the Gilded Fork played silently. Bridget watched herself walk, stumble, pause, and then deliberately fling the water at Zadie. The camera angle showed the calculated cruelty in her eyes. It was devastating proof. Bridget felt a rush of blood to her face, shame mingling with defiant anger. She stammered out a familiar, weak denial. It was a slip. The tray was wet, I swear. It was an accident. This less extreme event, her pathetic, obvious lie, fell flat in the sterile, air-conditioned room. Zadie looked away, as if pained by the lack of honesty. Alastair didn't argue. He simply picked up a thick corporate file with Bridget's name neatly tabbed on the side. This was the extreme event that broke her spirit. He read out loud. August 14th. Left a spider on the table of a customer who complained about the wait time. February 2nd. Switched the vegetarian and meat orders for a loud party. You have a documented pattern of passive-aggressive revenge, Ms. Bridget. Alastair closed the file with a definitive snap, the sound echoing in the silent room. He didn't yell, but his voice was cold steel. Do you understand now? Your denial is meaningless. We know your history. Bridget stared at her hands, realizing he hadn't just looked at her job. He had meticulously excavated every small, secret act of vengeance she had ever committed. She felt exposed, like every moment of her life had been recorded, and now the judgment was here. Later that night, the mood in the Sterling penthouse was strangely quiet. Alastair was on the phone, satisfied with the pending termination paperwork. He had delivered his justice, but Zadie, lying in her luxurious bed, felt no peace. She confessed to Alastair that the neat, corporate revenge felt hollow, like treating a symptom instead of the disease. She still felt violated. Alastair, always pragmatic, was dismissive. This was the less extreme event, a typical marital disagreement. Justice is justice, Zadie. She's been dealt with. It's time to move on and focus on the baby. But Zadie couldn't move on. She argued that the young woman's hostility was too raw, too desperate to be just a random act of racism. She recognized the look in Bridget's eyes. The conflict escalated into an extreme event. Zadie insisted she needed to meet Bridget again, alone, not for confrontation, but for conversation. Alastair was furious, his voice rising in rare anger. He absolutely forbade it, calling it reckless and irresponsible given her condition. She's unstable. You're pregnant, Zadie. You are not a social worker, and you're not risking our child for a misguided sense of charity. Zadie knew she couldn't win the argument, but she also knew she had to go. She felt a profound conviction that understanding Bridget's motive was the only way to truly heal her own lingering pain. She had to break the cycle of hate and fear. Her fear for the baby was matched only by her intense desire to be a different kind of leader than the teacher who had dismissed her years ago. While Alastair slept soundly, exhausted by the day's corporate drama, Zadie crept out of bed. She used the corporate login details he had carelessly left open on his work laptop. She pulled up the HR file on Bridget, searching for the small, nondescript residential address. Zadie copied the address, her heart pounding with the twin feelings of guilt for defying her husband and a strange, determined sense of mission. The next morning, Zadie drove her pearl-white luxury SUV into the heart of Bridget's rundown neighborhood. The sight of the dilapidated buildings and overflowing trash bins was an environmental shock, a world away from her secure, manicured existence. This was the extreme event, forcing Zadie out of her comfort zone and into a confrontation with the stark reality of poverty. She found the correct building, the steps worn down and the air heavy with the smell of stale cooking oil. She knocked on the door, and after a long silence, Bridget opened it a crack. When she saw Zadie, the pregnant CEO's wife, standing on her doorstep, her eyes flared with instant hostility. This was the less extreme event, the predictable hostility. "What is this, a victory lap? Did you come to make sure I'm packing my bags?" Zadie ignored the insult. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly, and pulled out her phone. She opened her camera roll and found an old, faded photo of her mother and another woman, laughing at a family cookout. The other woman, dressed in a loud floral dress, was Evelyn Price. Zadie handed the phone to Bridget, who hesitantly took it. Bridget stared at the face in the picture. The same cold eyes, the same severe hairstyle, the woman who had wrongly accused her of theft years ago and ruined her chances at a better life. The realization hit Bridget like a physical blow. The wealthy woman she dumped water on was related to the architect of her past suffering. It was a cruel, shocking twist of fate, the extreme event that connected them forever. Zadie saw the pain and shock register on Bridget's face. Zadie whispered, her voice gentle, "That's my Aunt Evelyn." She was furious when she found out I married Alistair because of his money, not his connections. The silent realization that the universe had connected them through an act of past cruelty hung heavy in the air, a bond forged not in friendship, but in injustice. Zadie pulled up a rickety folding chair. The two women now sitting across from each other in Bridget's cramped living room. Bridget began to speak, her voice raw and defeated. She recounted the injustice of the theft accusation by Evelyn Price, the destruction of her reputation, and how that single lie had led to years of desperation and the small, spiteful acts that defined her waitressing career. Zadie listened, completely silent, providing the less extreme event of simple, steady presence. When Bridget finished, she looked defiant, expecting judgment. But Zadie offered none. Instead, she took a deep breath and began to share her own story. The extreme event of profound personal revelation. "I understand what it's like to be powerless, to be targeted because of who you are," Zadie said. She confessed a deep, painful secret she had never even fully shared with Alistair. Zadie told Bridget that in her own struggle to deal with racial microaggressions and the intense pressure to succeed in a white-dominated corporate world, she had developed a severe eating disorder as a teenager. She explained it was her desperate attempt to control one small part of her life when the rest fell out of control. It was a secret born of self-hatred, trauma, and the constant feeling of being judged. Bridget, the cynical waitress, stared at Zadie, the wealthy executive's wife, stunned by the vulnerability. She realized the pain beneath the expensive, now dry dress was real, deep, and shared. For the first time, Bridget saw not a target of her anger, but a wounded soul fighting a similar kind of war. They were connected by the feeling of systemic injustice and self-loathing. Zadie stood up, her hand gently resting on the curve of her belly. "We both know what it's like to be defined by someone else's hate and judgment," she said. She was done with revenge. She was focused on redemption. "Now, tell me, what's the one thing you really want to do with your life if you had a blank slate?" If you're loving this story so far, share this video with someone that needs to watch this video. Bridget hesitated for a long time, the question of her dream job hanging heavy in the small, cluttered room. She finally admitted that she had always wanted to work with databases and records, a desire rooted in wanting to prove her innocence after the theft incident. That was the spark of a less extreme event, a simple, honest aspiration. Zadie smiled, her mind already racing with possibilities. The extreme event occurred moments later when Zadie offered the proposition. She pulled out a business card and slid it across the worn kitchen table. Alastair's company needs to diversify its talent. I'm going to put you forward for an immediate corporate trainee position in the Records and Information Management Department. It's a clean slate, Bridget. You can rise above your circumstances. Bridget's shock quickly turned to guarded suspicion. Why would you do this? After what I did. Zadie looked her straight in the eye, resting a hand on her belly. Because I don't want my child to inherit my trauma or your bitterness. We're breaking the cycle. Bridget, seeing the genuine resolve, finally accepted, tears welling up as she realized the chance for true redemption was real. Alastair, however, was incandescent with fury when Zadie returned home and told him the news. The extreme event was the first truly explosive fight of their marriage. He paced the penthouse, his voice echoing off the glass walls. You went against my direct order, and you hired a documented vandal. This is not charity, Zadie. This is corporate negligence. You're risking the entire structure we built. He accused her of being a naive do-gooder, undermining his professional authority with an emotional decision. She assaulted my pregnant wife. I wanted her gone, and you invited her into our company. Zadie stood her ground, arguing that true leadership was about transformative justice, not just cold, corporate revenge. The chapter ended with Alastair slamming his office door shut, leaving Zadie alone and worried that her act of kindness might just have ruined her marriage. The tension between Zadie and Alastair was thick and suffocating, extending for days. Zadie sought comfort and wisdom outside their penthouse. She decided to visit Elijah Sterling, Alastair's grandfather and the founder of the entire corporate empire, who was now living in quiet retirement. She found him sitting in his sun-drenched library, an oasis of calm. The less extreme event was Zadie's heartfelt confession to Elijah. She explained the Bridget situation, the past connection to her Aunt Evelyn, and the resulting fight with Alastair. Elijah listened patiently, occasionally taking a thoughtful sip of his tea, his eyes twinkling with ancient wisdom. He didn't rush to judgment or take his grandson's side. The extreme event was Elijah's unexpected and powerful response. He told Zadie a story about his own past, a time when he was a young, arrogant businessman who nearly lost everything due to a bad investment. He had mercilessly sidelined a small, rival black business owner years before, only to have that man step in with critical support during Elijah's darkest hour, saving the company from ruin. Elijah gently placed his hand over Zadie's. Alastair sees everything through the lens of power and profit. You see people, and that's the greatest asset Sterling Global has ever had. He validated Zadie's courage, calling her decision to hire Bridget a true demonstration of strength. He dismissed Alastair's fear as corporate paranoia, praising Zadie for choosing empathy over revenge. The chapter ended with Elijah making a quiet, decisive phone call. He dialed Alastair's private line, his voice firm and unwavering. Son, your wife has the right of it. You need to stop acting like a boss and start listening like a partner. Now, let's talk about that waitress. Bridget arrived for her first day at Sterling Global, a nervous, knot tightening in her stomach. The less extreme event was her immersion into the Records and Information Management Department. It was dull work, mostly tracking and logging digital files, but she was meticulous and kept her head down. She was determined to prove Zadie right and Alastair wrong. She quickly learned the corporate geography and the unspoken rules. One afternoon, while looking for a misplaced hard drive, she walked past the office of Marcus Sterling, Alastair's younger, flashier brother and one of the senior executives. The door was slightly ajar, and she heard voices. Curiosity, a habit developed from years of eavesdropping on restaurant customers, pulled her close. The extreme event was the conversation she overheard. Marcus was speaking to another executive, complaining bitterly about Alastair's control over the company. She heard Marcus clearly discussing a transfer of funds and creating a paper trail that would point the blame directly at Alastair for missing millions. She realized instantly that Marcus was secretly funneling company money into a rival firm and was preparing to frame his own brother. Bridget's blood ran cold. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to know this. The man who had hired her for a second chance was about to be destroyed by his own family. The less extreme event was the terrifying moral dilemma. Reporting Marcus meant risking everything: her new job, her freedom, and perhaps her safety. Staying silent meant watching the kind woman who saved her lose everything. She crept away from the office, the secret burning like acid in her mind. Bridget knew she couldn't ignore the betrayal. She didn't want to save Alistair, but she absolutely had to protect Zadie. The chapter ended with Bridget staring at her computer screen, her mind racing with a singular, terrifying goal: finding irrefutable proof. The search for proof became Bridget's all-consuming obsession. Working late every night, she used her legitimate access to the company's file system, moving slowly and methodically, a digital ghost. The less extreme event was the tedious, painstaking effort of cross-referencing ledger entries and obscure project codes that only someone in her department could access without suspicion. The extreme event was when she finally hit pay dirt. Deep within a project folder labeled Archive Client Data, she found a subfolder secured with a basic password: Marcus's birth year. Inside were encrypted spreadsheets showing large, unauthorized wire transfers to an offshore account owned by a shell corporation. She also found digital copies of Alistair's forged signature. The evidence was undeniable, meticulous, and devastating. Bridget had the digital files, but she knew she couldn't simply email them. She needed a physical backup, a way to ensure the data survived if Marcus got suspicious. The less extreme event was her trip to the nearest office supply store, where she bought the smallest, most discreet flash drive she could find. The ultimate extreme event was copying the files. She stayed late, her hands shaking as she watched the data transfer. Every second felt like an eternity. As the process completed, she heard footsteps outside the office. Panic seized her throat. She quickly pulled the flash drive, shoving it deep into the lining of her cheap purse, and pretended to be sorting stacks of paper. The footsteps passed, but the sheer terror of almost being caught solidified her resolve. She was officially risking her life to expose the family of the man she had once tried to humiliate. If you're loving this story so far, smash that like button and let us know with a fire emoji in the comments. The next day, still shaking from her near miss, Bridget sought out Zadie during her lunch break. They met in a small, out-of-the-way cafe near the Sterling Global building. The less extreme event was Bridget carefully laying out the truth, speaking in quick, hushed tones about Marcus and the stolen money. Zadie's face went white. She was initially skeptical. It was hard to believe Alistair's own brother would commit such an act. But Bridget pulled out the flash drive and showed Zadie one of the forged documents on her phone. The signature was close, but Zadie knew Alistair's handwriting too well. She believed her. The less extreme event was their quiet agreement. They had to handle this with surgical precision to avoid a public meltdown. The extreme event started when Zadie chose a reckless confrontation. Instead of taking the evidence to Alistair or the board, she cornered Marcus in his private Sky Lounge office that afternoon, with a flash drive hidden safely in her maternity bag. She started calmly. "Marcus, we need to talk about the Archive Client Data folder." Marcus's polite executive facade crumbled instantly. He denied everything with a laugh, calling Bridget a desperate liar, until Zadie showed him the single unedited photo of the forged signature she had on her phone. The smile vanished. He realized Zadie had seen the evidence. His eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a menacing growl, full of quiet rage. "You stupid little wife. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into, Zadie. This is bigger than you, and you should worry about more than just your husband's job." His threat was clear, cold, and utterly terrifying. Marcus Sterling's threat, simple and vicious, was the extreme event that finally shattered Alistair's corporate calm. He realized this wasn't just about a job. It was a family war, and Marcus was playing dirty. Before Alistair could fully process the danger, his phone rang with terrible news. His grandfather, Elijah, the wise old patriarch, had suffered a minor heart attack, likely brought on by the stress of hearing about Marcus's escalating behavior. Alistair and Zadie rushed to the hospital. This less extreme event, the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the private hospital room, forced a desperate reconciliation. Alistair, pale and shaken, finally looked at Zadie, not as an employee, but as his partner. He confessed he had been blind, prioritizing corporate optics over his wife's intuition. He apologized for his anger, realizing her charity toward Bridget was actually their best defense. The emotional contrast was high. Fear for Elijah mixed with fear for their future. When they were finally allowed to see him, Elijah looked frail, his skin almost translucent against the white hospital sheets. This was the extreme event, the near loss of their guide. He spoke weakly, but his words cut through the silence. Marcus has always been selfish, but now he is desperate. He will burn this company to the ground to avoid shame. Elijah leaned closer to Zadie, ignoring Alistair for a moment. You trusted your gut, Zadie. You saw the difference between a broken person and a wicked one. Now, you use that kindness as your sword. He told Alistair, with unexpected firmness, that they needed to expose Marcus before Marcus could execute his final, calculated move. He concluded with a stern, final command that left both Zadie and Alistair reeling. You have 48 hours. Act like Sterlings, or lose everything. And Alistair, listen to your wife. The chapter ended with Alistair gripping Zadie's hand, the weight of his grandfather's mandate forcing him to pivot from defense to a terrifying, high-stakes offense. The decision was made. They would expose Marcus at the annual Sterling Global Charity Gala. It was the highest-profile event of the year, covered by every major financial news outlet, making it the perfect stage for the extreme event. The atmosphere in the days leading up to the gala was tense, a deceptive calm before a corporate hurricane. The less extreme event was Zadie having her final fitting for her gown. She looked beautiful and radiant, but her eyes held a fierce, calculated focus. Bridget, who was quietly working overtime, meticulously prepped the digital files, ensuring the evidence was locked onto a secure server, ready to be displayed with a single click. Every detail was planned, every possibility accounted for. The night of the gala arrived. The ballroom was dazzling, packed with investors, journalists, and rivals. Alistair went through the motions, delivering a short speech about the company's commitment to community, but his eyes constantly scanned the room for Marcus. Zadie, standing next to him, felt the vulnerability of her pregnant body under the scrutiny of hundreds of powerful people. Then, the extreme event hit. Marcus arrived late, walking in with a smug, calculated swagger, a man about to deliver a death blow. Just as Alistair was announcing a major new philanthropic initiative, Marcus stepped forward, his voice booming with fake indignation. He held a stack of carefully falsified documents. I can't let my brother lie to you all, Marcus shouted, his voice echoing over the microphone. He accused Alistair of embezzlement and fraud, handing the fake ledgers to a stunned reporter near the front table. These documents prove my brother has been bleeding this company dry for years. Chaos erupted instantly. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward, and the glittering night dissolved into a terrifying frenzy of accusation, leaving Zadie and Alistair standing alone at the center of a swirling vortex of scandal. The ballroom was a nightmare of shouting voices and blinding lights. The extreme event of Marcus's betrayal had successfully destabilized the entire event. Alistair was paralyzed, his mind racing to counter the baseless accusations being screamed by the press. The forged documents looked convincing, and the doubt was clearly spreading through the investor crowd. Zadie, however, moved with quiet, maternal strength. She gently pushed Alistair aside and walked directly to the main stage microphone. This was the less extreme event, a pregnant woman taking charge of a corporate crisis. Her voice, though softer than Marcus's, was amplified, demanding silence. "I understand your confusion," she said, her tone steady. "But you have only seen the forgery. Now let's look at the truth." The true extreme event followed. On the main projection screen, which minutes ago displayed a corporate logo, Zadie displayed a clean, side-by-side comparison. On the left, Marcus's forged signature. On the right, Alistair's actual signature. Then, she unveiled Bridget's hard work. The wire transfer records, bank details, and an indisputable digital trail leading directly to Marcus's hidden shell company. The room gasped, the reporters falling silent as they processed the real evidence. Marcus, realizing the game was over, made a frantic, desperate dash for the back exit. But before he could escape, the doors swung open, and the imposing figure of Elijah Sterling, released from the hospital against doctor's orders, stood framed in the doorway, supported by 2 aides. He walked slowly to the microphone. "I called the authorities myself," Elijah announced, his voice raspy but firm. "My grandson will answer for his crimes." The final extreme event was the sound of police sirens suddenly wailing from outside. 2 uniformed officers entered the room, making a beeline for the terrified Marcus, who finally crumpled to the floor in defeat. The chapter ended with Marcus being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of bitter, defeated rage, while the crowd watched in stunned silence, their moral compasses completely reset. The days following the gala were a whirlwind of cleanup, damage control, and unexpected grace. The less extreme event was the media's shift. Having witnessed the real-time reversal of fortune, they now hailed Alistair and Zadie as heroes of corporate integrity, praising their courage and transparency. Alistair held a powerful press conference where he spoke not only of business, but of the importance of redemption and kindness, crediting Zadie and even acknowledging Bridget's role in saving the company. With Marcus facing legal action, the company was secured and the internal strife settled. Zadie, feeling a genuine sense of peace and closure, made her final, most important visit. This was the extreme event of genuine, earned connection. She went to see Bridget, not at the office, but at a modest, clean apartment, a better place Bridget had secured with her new salary. Bridget was radiant. She told Zadie that not only was she excelling at her job, but she had used her newfound stability to reach out to her struggling mother, Melinda, who was now in a long-term recovery program. The cycle of pain was truly broken. Bridget looked at Zadie, tears in her eyes. "You didn't just give me a job, Zadie. You showed me that revenge isn't necessary when you have purpose." As Zadie hugged Bridget goodbye, feeling the full weight of their shared, redemptive journey, she felt a sudden, sharp contraction. She gasped, the pain cutting through her serene moment. She was going into labor, right there on the sidewalk outside Bridget's apartment. The final extreme event of the chapter was the desperate rush to the car, the entire world narrowing down to a single, powerful fact. The new life she had fought so hard to protect was finally ready to arrive. The first sound the baby made wasn't a cry, but a strong, clear wail, the sound of triumph. The extreme event was the delivery of their daughter, Charity Sterling, a beautiful, healthy girl with Zadie's clear eyes and Alistair's determined chin. Alistair held Zadie's hand, his corporate shell completely melted away, replaced by pure, exhausted fatherhood. A few days later, the less extreme event of settling in began. They brought Charity home to the penthouse, a haven now filled with baby gear and the scent of new life. Zadie held her daughter, rocking her gently, realizing that the cold water dumped on her months ago hadn't ruined her. It had forced her into an act of self-defense that saved her family, her husband's career, and another woman's life. The whole terrible incident had somehow birthed something truly good. The final twist, the true extreme event, happened 5 years later. A flash forward shows a bustling boardroom. Alistair, relaxed and happy, is addressing a meeting remotely from a beach vacation. Zadie, sharp, impeccably dressed, and radiating quiet authority, stands at the head of the long table. She is now the CEO of Sterling Global, having taken the reins to ensure the company's future remained rooted in integrity and people. Seated right next to her, confidently taking notes and running the day-to-day operations, is her chief of staff, Bridget. Bridget, now a poised and respected executive, gives Zadie a small, knowing look, a shared silent acknowledgement of the crazy path that brought them here. Zadie smiles, then looks down at her desk, where a framed photo sits. Alistair, herself, and a beautiful 5-year-old Charity. She closes her laptop, the screen reflecting her success. Kindness, Zadie understood, wasn't naive. It was the ultimate poetic form of revenge. It was the only way to truly win. If you gasped, cried, or cheered during this story, hit the like button. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done when the waitress dumped the water? And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, twist-filled dramas like this one.